We're now live on YouTube. Right. Welcome to this Open Security Summit session in June 2024. And a good old friend of mine, Ben, we've gone a long way, work a lot of projects together, doing a presentation about something he's been doing for a while. And I definitely feel it's one of those projects where there's an intersection of technologies that are happening now that can really allow this to go to the next level. And it's solving some really hard challenges in our industry. So, Ben, over to you.
Thank you. It's great. So, yeah, I mean, what I'm talking today about is production crew identity. And the great thing about media is everyone's an expert and everyone can explain to their grandmother what they do. It's about movies. But what's interesting, I've worked across over the last 20 years across distribution with the launch of BBC iPlayer, around audience measurement with Barb in the UK. And the last 5 years, I've been working in the production space. So initially with Amazon Studios over on the West Coast, and then with NBCU. And there are some fundamental challenges in production if you're trying to use cloud infrastructure. So cloud pretty well everywhere is being used because if you look at the durability, the resilience, the scale, most industries are moving their infrastructure to cloud. Media has a certain set of problems, and one of those is around the size of the objects. They're very large files, and the fact that every production is a kind of pretty ephemeral. They're pulled together, a group of people, a disparate tribe of people pulled together for a production. That could be a couple of months, or for a big feature film, could be 18 months. And so one of the issues there is you've got extremely large files around the world with a mixture of people who may not be full-time employees. How do you get them to work on this stuff safely and securely? And one of the fundamentals there is around identity. So the CDSA is the Content Delivery and Security Association. It's got a wide range of membership amongst media owners and media vendors. And I'm the technology director. And what I'm doing is I'm running a series of working groups where we're trying to determine the best practice. And this production security working group is really it's composed of people from this roster on the right. So the really big streamers, Amazon Studios, Apple, Netflix, the major studios like Disney, Fox, Legendary, NBC Universal. So we've got a very good roster of people, and we're pulling together to solve similar problems. The three problems that this production working group is looking at is around production identity, around how you track process and mapping to controls, and then how you make sure that when you find issues and incidents, you match those back against the person, against the policy, against the process to say, is there something wrong with the process? Is it something wrong with the person? Or is it something wrong with the policy and the control? So the fundamental problem is quite easy to describe. Pretty well everyone on this call will have seen or heard of Jurassic World series. And the latest box office smash back in 2021, I think, was Jurassic World Dominion. And that was, it made $1 billion for NBC Universal. And if you actually look at how that was made over about an 18-month period, you can break down, and this is all public domain information. I just went to IMDb and I pulled off the list of the cast and crew. So it's not the full list of everyone that worked on it, but it's a pretty good representation. And of those kind of 1,500 odd people that were on 1,600 odd people that were on that show, there would have been probably 5 studio execs, the ones writing the checks. There were 150 cast, 1,200 production, and then probably around 300 vendors. And the bulk of those vendors came from Industrial Light and Magic, who are visual effects. But there's a range of different people on there. So you've got everything from a composer sitting in his garage with a laptop, all the way up to a heavy engineering, massive workstations, big rendering nodes, multiple servers. And you've got a lot of files moving around. So the issue is, how do you give people access? And right now, I've surveyed maybe 5 major feature films from the roster, from the constituents.
Sorry,
And
Ben, can you just start the slideshow? It just makes the font a little bit bigger.
oh yeah, sure. Let me just.
No, at the top.
Yeah, sorry.
Slideshow. If you go to slideshow on the right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's just that I lose some of my notes if I do that, but that's fine. Okay. Okay, is that better?
Yeah, it's perfect. That's much better.
Right, okay. So yeah, and so you can see here this list, and if I go through that list, you can see there are really big companies like Industrial Light and Magic, 250 people. And then you get down to someone like LiDAR Lounge who are scanning a set, and there'll just be a couple of guys for a few days. So there's this real big mix. When you actually look at how you identify the people, you could say, well, we give them a laptop, which is a corporate laptop with access to the SAP system, or we give them a box ID for sharing files and content, or we give them a production email, ben@jurassicworld.com. So, and if you actually start measuring, and this is a typical measurement, probably only 10 to 15% of the people on that production get measured. And there's a lot of attention paid to content security, to making sure pre-release content doesn't leak. There's a lot of paranoia, a lot of physical security around that. And yet here we have, across this supply chain, we've only got a very small number of people actually being identified. And what that means is you've got a lot of shared information. You've got a lot of people maybe using a common login, and everyone here is going to be fully cognizant of how bad that is. There's an organization called Movie Labs who have a thing called the 2030 Vision, and this is really saying it's a kind of North Star for the industry. They're funded by all the major studios to say, what should we be doing in terms of this transition to cloud? And one of their principles is that every individual has got to be identified and verified, and access permissions efficiently and consistently managed. So this is something the industry is saying they need, but if you actually look at what's happening today, it's not happening. And then you've got other issues. So onboarding people, offboarding people, giving people access can take, maybe someone's only on the production for a couple of weeks, and if it takes you 2 weeks to get them on board, it's kind of zero-sum game. We also have people that shouldn't have access to content, maybe because they've been taken off the set, with remaining access, or you have an accountant that will work for 2 weeks and then come back for another 2 weeks in 3 months' time. So it's a pretty badly managed situation, really across the industry. So within the tier that's distribution, which is very much scaled up, the Disney Plus, the Max, the Netflix, there's a lot of organization. It's very much steady state. And people are well managed in that, but in production, it's a bit of a black hole because every production is different. And I think probably what most people don't understand is that it's not that the technology is provided by the studio. Quite often, like with Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan, he has a check written to him for 100 million, and then he decides in that pyramid of people he's got on his production who's going to do what and who takes. So he's got his favorite vendors. So very little of that money is actually spent on core technology. Now, someone like Netflix has got huge discounts on Amazon Web Services, massive. And if they're able to leverage that, you really want this to be running on the studio's infrastructure. Sorry, was there a question?
Nope.
Great. So I think I've pretty clearly stated the problem. Let me talk then about what we've done to try and address this problem. Again, everyone here will be familiar with NIST and with the 863 series of papers, but we've broken it down into these 3 stages, and kind of going back to that group of studios, we've got a common interest group. So there are people on this group who are responsible for the identity. This is being run by Keith Ritloff, who was at NBCU with me until February this year. And previously, we worked together at Amazon Studios. But we've got pretty good representation from a set of people who are responsible for identity on productions. So the first stage is verification. And this is where you've got to establish that the person is the right person. Quite often, this is outsourced to a commercial service. And this is a bit that Movie Labs have initially tackled. They've got a production user identity, this idea that you can verify that someone worked on a particular project. The second bit is authentication. And there, you've always got a corporate large studios. So someone like Comcast are Microsoft wall to wall, and everything is driven off a central GAL. The problem with that is if you're going to work for Comcast for 10 years, then you can tolerate 2-3 weeks of onboarding. There's a regular process. If you're on a production, they'll write the check, and the next day, why isn't the accountant working? So there's a very short takeoff ramp. And if you have to then try and force fit that onto a corporate process, you have a real problem. So really what this group has agreed is saying, look, we've got a set of studio assets, which might be SAP systems or corporate systems that some people need to access. There are definitely some production assets, media, but also costumes, sets, crew lists, a whole bunch of different applications that people use. How do you make sure that the right person has the right access? And then talking about industrial light and magic, you've got these third-party vendors who will then have their own assets, their own workflows, their own content. So what we've kind of agreed is a common way of saying, let's federate these IDPs together. And typically what people are using is they probably have Active Directory as the core in the studio, whatever size studio it is. I guess some standouts there would be Apple, who have their own identity system, of course. But really what you want to be able to do is, instead of trying to force fit everyone onto that corporate studio IDP, you federate those IDPs together. So initially giving the production an IDP and federation that with the studio. So different people are at different stages with this. So Amazon have originals access, and for everyone going onto an Amazon production, they get given an originals access ID. So that's a separate production ID, actually held in Okta, that's then being used to link into the corporate, the central Amazon IDP. But then you might also get a vendor who would be could be on Active Directory. The ideal situation is that someone on a production is authenticating and going in to get to those production assets. If they need to, if they're an accountant, they can authenticate and then federate out into those studio assets. Or a third-party vendor who might be an artist working on a particular visual effects sequence can federate with their own ID, can authenticate with their own IDP, but then get federated access through the production IDP to the right scene, to the right element they need to get to. So we've been working on this now for about a year. I think we're in a good state in that we've got for across all those studios, we've agreed this common approach with around verification, authentication, and federation. And where we've got to for, say, Paramount, and they announced this at IBC last year, is they see themselves saving $40 million over the next 5 years just by controlling identity on their productions. And they've got maybe 200 television shows running at any one time, and a number of features and a whole bunch of other little marketing workflows or bits of advertising that are going on. And by basically controlling production identity across that, so you'll know, everyone will know that the most profitable piece of television on US networks at the moment is Yellowstone, and Yellowstone are actually now one of the first productions for Paramount to have 100% identity across their productions. So there are some people that don't necessarily need that full access. So if you're an extra, you're just walking onto the set, or you're flipping burgers in a catering truck, or you're just running the generator, you don't necessarily need full access to all the digital assets. But as a foundational element, to have 100% of identity controlled, it means you can tie that into a number of other pieces. So it's all right. And what we're moving on to now is the next stage. So once you've got that verification, authentication, and federation, the next piece is how you authorize. And that means when you get to access that asset, what can you actually do with it? And there again, I think people would be surprised, but there's a real mix of permissions that aren't properly related to each other. What you really want to make sure is that when someone is controlling from, and normally this would be in the production office, there's some poor harassed admin that's going to get bullied by the cinematographer to say this person needs access to everything. They'll give that access. And most people aren't very technical on a production, although they're extremely skilled in their own craft, which would be color or camera or lighting or whatever it is. They don't really understand technology. Most of the technology on the set is driven by spreadsheets or FileMaker Pro, which I didn't believe was still a database until I was working in media. But so FileMaker Pro and spreadsheets is the default. So what you find is that people will tend to give very broad permissions, and the production office will give permissions to everything. And then you have an issue with how you track what version control, what changes were going on. So to give you an example, working with Amazon Studios in New Zealand on Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, when that production wrapped, they wrote 9 petabytes of content to deep storage. Now, 9 petabytes of content is a lot of storage, but within that, there was huge amounts of duplication and versioning. So to go back to that and do anything with that content afterwards is not kind of well organized. It's more like archaeology. You have to try and find that out. And we found this when trying to recover LTOs to recut Hunters, again, one of the Prime Video series. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to have people recover the LTO tapes just to be able to go back and recut that series 1. And this is not a series from 10 or 20 years ago. This isn't a restoration like the BFI. This is actually fairly recent content. And yet what people tend to do in production is when they wrap that production, when they finish, they're not really concerned about what comes afterwards. They've delivered their library masters, their full content. All the supporting material, all the context gets left in the state it was left in. So really people drop stuff and then run to the next project. So it's quite a big problem. So this is the next kind of stage of what we're doing, having established this idea of how you get production identity, then being able to do roles and permissions. And I think this is critical in the zero trust environment. So again, there's a lot of talk about zero trust, but the example I would give here is DreamWorks. So DreamWorks is a 800-man animation company based in Glendale in California, just at the kind of the eastern end of the Burbank Valley. And they've been used to 27 years of having everything in-house. They're now starting to outsource some of their work and bring in external vendors. And they have a very traditional perimeter-based security. Pretty well everything inside is flat. So pretty well, because there's a very high degree of trust, people use information and they have flat access to pretty well everything. And everyone's got the right ethos and the right spirit. When you start then outsourcing that to some other country or to an external vendor, you have a major problem. So there is definitely a need within production to have that, but you're also seeing some of the more traditional setups coming under challenge. So I talked about roles and permissions, but where is the data? Well, the data is actually held inside a number of applications. So there's what they call a birthright set of applications. When you onboard onto a production, you'll probably be given access to a bunch of different things. So there'll be the general piece, the Entra AD or Okta or Google login. There'll be Office 365 or more typically Google Workspaces. So someone like Netflix have got 60,000 Google Workspace accounts being used to actually do the email for productions. There are things for sign-offs, so DocSign Acrobat. There's obviously a deal of collaboration, and then there's some more specific things around review and approval cycles. So Adobe's Frame.io or Autodesk's recent acquisition of Pix or Moxion, now termed Flow. And then accounts and HR is where the proxy for identities can be managed by lots of people. So there are a number of different applications, but entertainment partners are one of the kind of giants of this industry. And then cast and crew are kind of a competitor. And then for storage and file movement, you've got Aspera and Signiant, but predominantly people are using Box for their asset management, and then various shared drives. But if I look across those that stack of applications, when we're talking to them as a group, as a group of their major customers, especially for the more media specific things like entertainment partners, what's really interesting is there is not a consistent approach for single sign-on, for roles and permissions, or for API access. So as an industry, this is a massive cause of friction. You'll find that people will be logging in with multiple IDs into multiple applications, downloading content, sharing it on drives, on personal emails, and then trying to update other spreadsheets. So what we really want to get to is a position where we have a consistent way of dealing with SSO, the federated approach I've talked about, a way of mapping the schema for roles and permissions, because every application will have a different history and a different way of working out what those structures are. And it's how you normalize that and say, everyone can have their own schema, their own specific advantage, but how do you map those together when you're trying to have consistent roles and permissions? And in my experience, security isn't about technology, it's about implementation, it's about people and taking shortcuts and being forced to do things under duress. And production is nothing but if it's not a high pressure environment where people are used to just working around what the studio does to be able to get the content out. So we are starting to talk to these vendors as a group and say, look, we have a common way of doing things, which is a shared resource, trying to get rid of the friction that is currently is in the industry, make it cheaper to do productions. And we're in a world where there's pressure. I don't know if everyone's looked at what's going on in Hollywood, but there is they've all spent a lot of money on creating their own streaming platforms. So I think Disney Plus was in the low billions that they spent. None of them are making profits apart from Netflix in that regime. So there's a lot of pressure on Hollywood and the feature films. In television generally, there is downward pressure because of the shift of advertising to social media platforms like TikTok. So television advertising, brand advertising is down by about 14%. So again, there's a lot of pressure on those TV programs. And what that means is that when people are coming to commission shows, they need to make sure they reduce their costs, they do more for less. And the only way of doing that is by reducing this waste, this friction we've got in the system already. So I think this fundamentally addresses, some of those issues. So the way we've approached this is to try and say, instead of trying to be prescriptive and say, here is a master schema that you have to adhere to, because everyone will come from a different place and not everyone needs the same set of content, is to try and lay out some principles. So I haven't got it here, but there's a white paper that we're drafting, which says across all these different studios, what are the principles that we want to be able to do? And here are some of them. So again, trying to make sure you've got clear roles and you can attach those permissions to a project, because you get a big variance from something like Rings of Power, which might cost, I think it costs in just under $1 billion to make, and had 1,500 VFX artists working around the world, down to 2 men in a handy cam shooting a documentary. So you've got to make sure, and the terminology is very varied from feature films, TV to advertising. So it's making sure that you've got the same kind of structures that can be applied across all of those. And that common vocabulary, I think, is that the semantics of how you treat this we should be able to speak in the language of the creatives to get adoption. One of the other concepts is the idea that there are tiers of access. So the director, the cinematographer, the lead editor, what they call the heads of departments, they've got a high degree of access, a high degree of trust. There'll be people who might have a more specific, narrow set of access to particular objects. And then you've got people who, as I said, all they need is a badge and to turn up on a day. They might need to know when they have to be somewhere or when they're having to serve coffee. And those are the low end people. what you find is one of the real issues here is admin. So at NBCU, there are a lot of problems because admin for productions was handled by a help desk and then went to another help desk in corporate. And if you got things wrong, they put in, you know, perfectly sensible kind of corporate weightings to say, oh, you've now done things wrong 3 times, therefore you got to wait for 24 hours before we do anything else. And that drives right behavior in a corporate, but in a production, that's infuriating. So what Apple have pioneered and what is now rolling out across the rest of this group is this idea of delegating that admin to a local team who are able to then apply best practice and give the right levels of access, but it means they're very responsive. There are also, roles and permissions around how you get external vendors to work. And really what you want to do is have the principle, again, from the Movie Labs 2030 of bring the tools and the skills to the work. So instead of taking these 10 terabytes of film a day off a camera and then shipping it to Singapore to do VFX work and then shipping it back again to Santa Monica to put these pieces together, what you really want to do is move it into the cloud once, distribute proxies globally, work on things where you need to, where you've got low latency, and then conform where the heavy asset has been contributed. But that's quite a sophisticated approach for cloud. When we were speaking to one of the major studios 2 weeks ago, to the team that were actually doing cloud, responsible for driving this transition to cloud, we found that only 5% of the total edit volume was taking place on the cloud. So there's some big blockers. But again, this is where you need to make sure you've got these foundational elements, the identity, the roles and permissions, the asset tracking to be able to do this. And so we've got some focus use cases. So again, I don't know if people are familiar with the process of dailies, or rushes in old terminology, but basically when they run the camera, you've got a whole load of content that's shot many takes of the same thing. You want to be able to share that with the studio, with the people who are making the creative decisions to say, take that shot, not that shot, and apply it. So the dailies workflow is a good example where roles and permissions is important. Or again, the example I've talked about, that external VFX vendor. So I guess I've explained what the problem is. I've talked about what we're doing about it. There's not a huge deal more to talk about in terms of presentation, but I wanted to let everyone have an insight into how Hollywood works and what we're doing. I'd left some time for questions. I don't know if we're going to have questions, Dennis, on this call.
I haven't seen any here, but I have a number for you.
Go on, far away.
I think what's very interesting about what you just presented, and by the way, you just gave a masterclass of how media works across, how technology works across a campus organization, right? And some of these are no similar than the challenges that a big organization has, right? Because it's like how do you manage suppliers that goes from super mature clients with and partners and internal teams that have massive stuff to like groups of twos and threes, right? And everything in the middle, and how to make that whole thing more seamlessly, right? And I think what's interesting about the movie world is that you have a chance to innovate with every movie, right? Because at least you have a bit of a reset, every one of them, right? So you can kind of keep increasing the pace of it, right? I guess my first question is, this is I think another great case study of where the laws of complexity really cause problems, right? Because ultimately the thing is simple. The problem is to scale, right? The problem is how to give the right guidance to the right organization at the right time, with the right context, so that the people that need to do a lot of security need to do it, and the people who actually don't need to do a lot of security actually should just get on with it, right? And this is where I feel that Gen AI has the big power of not to create content. So again, this is not about using anywhere close to creating content, but just in a way taking this top level view that you have and start to create this very highly personalized in a way easy to delegate, right, environments, because you can now create analysis of what is quite complex and then create very specific outputs.
And to me, 80% of an AI problem is actually around the data. So
Yeah,
there are, everyone's got these models, but you've seen all the furore around people using copyrighted materials. The studios are very cognizant of that, and so the information isn't available. But just as AI is being used to accelerate the well, both attack and defense in cybersecurity, with looking at log analysis and being able to look
yeah.
for patterns and do training on those private sets of data. There's a wealth of data that you can put in here, but unless you can actually attribute that to an individual login, if it's just generalized data, I think it's pretty useless. So from a security point of view, to be able to um, have an incident report, as I talked about here, and to be able to then say, was that incident linked to the process, or was it the control? Is there something we're missing here more generally? Or is it the individual? Is it the individual that's doing wrong? They need more training, or they're doing something that's rogue. So, but
But that
without
that
that identity as a foundation, you can't really get to that.
no, no, I agree with that. And so the thinking is that you use Gen AI to find those gaps, right? But also to analyze the complexity. So it's nowhere even close to any kind of sensitive data, right? It's almost like this first scenario is purely used just to understand identity access management,
Yeah.
right? Like yesterday, there was a great session that I did with the guy from what's it called, Snowflake, and they're doing some really cool stuff of analyzing tickets, doing like lots of analysis based on raw data, right? So, for example, they were taking Jira tickets and then asking, do any of these Jira tickets actually have security related topics that we should be aware of, right? So I think what's very interesting about here is that if you look at it, you are really playing with the laws of complexity, right? Like you have a huge amount of data, a huge amount of mappings, a huge amount of players, and there's a lot of questions that you need to ask, especially taking into account that the format of that data is going to be quite different, right? In a lot of places, and also the audiences of that data is quite discrete, right? So I really like the idea of using the Gen AI ability to understand data, to understand context, so that you can find multiple LLMs. And the thinking here is you put them in sequence, right? It's not like you have one just LLM to give you the answer. You actually chain them, if you see what I
And,
mean.
and you're right. I mean, there are kind of two ends of the spectrum for the use of AI, and we're slightly off the zero trust thing, but I think it's really interesting. There's kind of use of transcription of meetings and the kind of the basic, very basic level that everyone understands with ChatGPT. And
Yeah.
then at the other end, there's the Sora hallucinatory art. So everyone's seen the videos. What no one sees when they do those Sora demos is the 1,000 videos that didn't work, that they've been pruned out. They just got the nice ones. And we've heard things coming out where I don't know if everyone's seen the Bubblehead video, but that Bubblehead video, which originally was put forward as being completely generated by AI, has actually was actually made by artists. So
Yeah.
it's so I think everyone's focused on the glamour side and on the very basic side, but I think there's a wide number of use cases where you've got sets of data where it was operationally infeasible, computationally infeasible to process, and now you've got the ability to run and learn with LLMs. You can actually process data that you couldn't process
And
before.
that's exactly what I'm saying here, right? Like this identity access management matrix that you have is ridiculously complex, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, you're now leveraging a lot of good tech that has evolved, but really the only solution you have ahead is either you start develop a lot of codes to automate some of this stuff, which is very expensive, doesn't really scale, nobody
No.
wants to do it, or you start to put layers of it. Let me share my screen. Let me share one thing, that one slide that I created, I think um, addresses a little bit this workflow. Can
Right.
you see this bit here? And
Yeah.
try, yeah, so if you look at this, right, I was kind of trying to map like the workflows, right? So normal workflows, you ask a question to LLM and then you get an answer. So this is when there's no memory, right? Can you see my mouse?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next step is that when you kind of feed the entire answer to the next question, right? So you kind of do that. The problem with this is it doesn't scale. It gets very expensive very quickly. as I discovered, right? Because what happens, although you can argue that even with large context windows, it's okay, this gets exponential, right? Because every time there's an answer, you add to it, right? And the answers can be quite verbose, right? So what a lot of the LLMs start to do is basically this, right? So when you get the answer from the first LLM, you kind of summarize it, and that's what you feed to the next one.
And what's really, what's really interesting for me is, and I was talking to the lady that runs for Prime Video, runs the AI projects, and they're doing things like up-resing video or looking at content navigation, things like this. But the two, there are two big problems that they have. One problem is that the models, the LLMs, are unobservable. So you can't really tell what's going on. The powerful ones with the multiple layers and different weightings, you can't really observe what's going on. So you can't apply guardrails and policies. You don't know what the result is going to be. And the second problem is, so you've just said here about the retraining and the cost there. The problem is that sorry, the problem is we'll come back to the other one. The second problem is that there's a lot of innovation in models. So models are coming out all the time. So if you've just operationally locked down your model and you've trained it and you're ready to go, and then suddenly version 5 comes along or a completely different model comes along and you want to apply it, the cost of then applying that and retraining that is very high. So how do you, and this was something that she confirmed that that it's not there. And the other issue that people don't have when they're doing just meeting transcription, where it's been trained on the internet and any public domain information, is when you have your own private model and you're trying to make sure you design this, that's another issue again, because you can't necessarily take advantage of some of the rapid innovation, but the model sets are changing pretty fast.
That's why my thinking is that I don't think you should be creating private models. I think you need to, it's like the worldly maps, man. I think you need to start looking at the models as a commodity, like I'm showing you here. So it's not about one model, it's about multiple models, right? So here's one, you get multiple answers. So what you then use, for example, another model, right? So if you look at this, right, what you have is you add a fourth model, right, which could actually be the most powerful one or not, right? So you then have, the 3 LLMs, and this is where you leverage the open source ones. Okay, maybe one is customized, but I think that until we really understand, like you said, the second problem, how the models work, I think you need to treat them all as a black box. In fact, I think the less content that you use from them, the better. Right.
And I don't know if you saw do you see Yann LeCun, who's one of the kind of like AI greats, the founder who's at Facebook now? And he said that basically, LLMs isn't the way forward, that semantic models is the way forward. So it's quite interesting that we've had this huge...
Yeah, it could be a variation, but I still feel there's going to be a variation of this, right? So this is where I think you should be looking a lot at this, which is where you have, for example, 3 LLMs, some open source, maybe some not, based on a question and not based on input. And then when you get the first level of summary, let's say an analysis, you fire another LLM where you ask the question, right? Is that okay, right? Was that a good answer to the question? Was he malicious, right? And et cetera, and even create a graph, right, while you're at it, right? But you see, this is where I think it gets very interesting, right? Because even from a security point of view, if you think about it, the probability of the 3 or 4 LLMs hallucinating at the same time in the same thing is less. The fact that you can then go and say, does this answer match the original question? And to be honest, this is where the LLMs are really good at. I still feel that is creating content where they're not very good at. Is when you say, like code, you say, here is code, modify this. They don't hallucinate, right? They literally just understand the structure and modify that bit. So this is
I mean, they're tremendously powerful, and for things that are very structured, like code commenting and things like that, they're fantastic. But and I'm not, not saying that all developers are 5-year-olds, but if you where someone I forget who it was described the AI, these LLMs, it's like talking to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. And so asking 4 or 5-year-olds that answer may not still have the same level of maturity or the governance or the compliance or the
so I disagree with that, man. I talk to ChatGPT every day, right? And it's not a 5-year-old, right? Like, trust me on that one, right? I think he hallucinates, right? And I think you need to understand where are the gaps and almost like...
So sorry, the point I wasn't making about these public models, I was saying private models. So if you've got a private model, then you have a different issue, I think, which is you've got a more tuned set. But
Yeah, but I think the problem with the private models, right, is the maintainability, right? Is the fact that the understanding, right, and the capabilities of the
yeah,
newer models, right?
which
And
is
that's
that
why, like,
versioning problem. Yeah,
yeah,
versioning
yeah,
problem.
yeah. Look, this is where, I look, on the stuff I'm doing, you kind of want this, right? If you think about it, where is it like that, right? You want a mode where basically you can run it directly, you can run it with self-hosted, you can run
Yes.
through. I don't know if you play with aggregators, these guys, they're like pretty cool, right? And then
Yeah.
you run it inside the cloud providers, right? But
Yeah.
you almost want to be able to leverage all of this and then bring your own content, right?
But but here's the issue, Dennis, which is the same issue, with cloud. We just were talking about with cloud DevOps, which is how many people are sophisticated enough who have the skills. So there's a skills issue here, which is in organizations. How do you make this so that it's able to be used in
Oh,
general?
no, I agree. I think this has to be an infrastructure, right? The same way that nobody should be designing an authentication system, right? I think we
Yeah.
need the infrastructure for this. But the infrastructure should be that. The infrastructure should be, here's your question, here's your set of questions, here's your data, here's a bunch of models, here's the workflow, here's a set of outputs that then the human own, right? And I think, look at your example, right? Here's the policy that we want, here's the multiple players, here's the guidance and the principles that we want. How do you now apply it to this use case?
Yeah, and I agree.
That's where,
What I'm trying to get to is the ability where we can start processing that data and applying these things.
yeah, yeah.
What's interesting is at the moment this data is dark, it's not illuminated, and it is archaeology to come back to it. So
I
I think
agree. Yeah,
so.
yeah,
The fundamentals here is the if you identify who it is and what they should be able to do, then you can look at a set of assets and work it out because it's amazing how dirty that asset structure is when you actually look
yeah.
at the
And that's the
reality.
problem a lot of people have is they're realizing that most organizations, the data is not very good, right? There was this good report I saw from McKinsey where they the biggest problem they had when they tried to create any internal bot was the fact that most of their knowledge was on PowerPoints, right? That nobody
Well,
had access to,
exactly.
right? So, but that's where I think you use the models for, right? Like I think you don't use it to create contents. In a way, you use it to bring on that light, like
You use it to moderate the content, not to create it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And to understand it, right? Or to give you the clues, right? To give you the paths, right? Like, for example, when you say, oh, I have 9 terabytes of data, right? Or petabytes of data, right? Um, Even to visualize that is very hard. But if you feed that data, right, into a model, the model can start, model models, they can break it down into the logistical areas. They can give you these roadmaps that you can then implement, right?
And I think we've got, an order of magnitude or several orders of magnitude more powerful tools, but this is the same problem for data, what used to be called data warehousing. And when someone tells me they're creating a data lake, I know they're creating a data swamp, that the data goes in, it never comes out. So,
Yeah.
and I think this is where you can use an LLM to drain the swamp, as long as that hasn't got political connotations, but it's you can actually go in there and use it to get through this morass of dirty data
Yeah.
and bring clean data out. That's what I think really exciting.
Yeah, and look, and your problem is, although it's not the bigger one, it's a good example of one that is complex enough that without, I would say, the LLM's reasoning being used as a toolkit, you don't scale.
No.
And again, you only have 2 options here, right? Or 3 options. You can use the best of what technology can give you, which you are, so you leverage, tools, but they're always going to have its limitations and they always can do so much, right? You either spend a lot of money on development to create custom workflows, right? And apply engineering to it, or you build now a hybrid solution where you have a bunch of APIs and you have a lot of the customizations in prompts, right? And in these sort of LLM workflows, which basically means that just by modifying the LLM, you basically have a different kind of pipeline. And that was the thing that I could never see how it scaled because, like even just again, like identity access management, right? Like how do you take this complexity parameters and say, for that individual, these are the 4 things you care about. Like when you say, I'm going to delegate access, well, you can only delegate access if you can give that person the right access and the right visibility and the right change, right? Like, or else it doesn't work, right? If you cannot go from a world where you go, well, this person makes a decision and here's the outcome and here's the reality and now here's the feedback loop, right? It doesn't scale, right?
And that's what's interesting to me. If you look at this, the semantics of a workflow and how you describe workflows, and how you visualize them.
Yeah,
That's the other working group we've got, which is how you. I think if you've got a picture, you've got a narrative, and you've got a
yeah,
spreadsheet, it's very easy to box that in. But I think that's also where I see a great application of these LLMs, which is to
absolutely.
pull
But
some of these
I
patterns
think
out.
those are the applications, right?
Yeah,
I still feel that the creation of content is a smoke and mirror. It's the use case is very narrow.
yeah.
Actually, ironically, it should be in the hands of the creators because they are the ones who can curate the content, right? Not replace them. But the real use is the understanding, right? Like that's the real one. The fact they can hallucinate is almost a side effect of how good it is,
And
right?
and what's
In,
interesting, I was in Palm Springs for a conference, and they had the latest, greatest kind of AI artists up there, and these guys were saying, yeah, like I'm a really experienced, I'm one of the early pioneers, and you know, I'm now kind of driving the forefront of this, and I've been working on it for 18 months. So it's like it's a very it's still the
I know.
Wild West. There's a lot
I
of
know.
change
It's a
going
good
on.
time to now, do this, right?
Yeah.
All right, man. This has been great. So, like, we'll chop it up in different bits, and I think, I think there's definitely a connection here with just scaling identity access management because I
Yes.
think that's really what you're trying to do, right? And going back to, I know another passion of yours is how do you connect the multiple standards, right? So how
Yeah.
you have that unified view. Again, I think that a lot of the new LLM workflows are going to be around that. So let's talk about that because I think